What's up, everybody? It's Megan here with the Financially Free Era podcast by SLP Wealth, and I'm feeling much better this week. You can still hear it a little bit in my voice, but last week, man, that was rough. Thanks for hanging in there with me. This week, I want to chat about the big, beautiful bill, the massive 887 page piece of legislation that just got signed in July 4th. It's a big document, and there was a lot of changes, a lot of things that went into it, and a lot of things that came out of it, and a lot of things that happened really fast is kind of the gist of how that got passed. It extends a lot of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which some of that is good. And it does add some significant immigration and border spending, though, and includes some sweeping cuts to healthcare and climate initiatives. There's a lot of things in it, so we'll chat about some of the highlights, and I'm sure this won't be the last time we're talking about it because it's such a big, document that there's a lot of nuance to these different things in and of themselves. And there's also some clarification that needs to happen because this is the legislation, right? And then the governing bodies of like that topic, so like the IRS, for example, or the Department of Education, or Homeland Security, like they have to go and interpret this law, this legislation, and put in processes to execute what this stuff is saying. So there's still a lot to come and a lot of interpretation to be had to come. But basically the bill passed the House and the Senate very quickly. It went through a really quick, I think, a pretty quick process. And there's, a lot of things in it that do matter and that do actually trickle down and will impact our folks, our clients. So let's talk a little bit about what's permanent. So the tax cuts did make some permanent changes. There was, the extension of the 2017 Trump tax cuts. Basically, the individual tax brackets that were temporary, they were supposed to sunset this year. They're now permanent. So that was something that was kind of hard. We knew that from 2017 to 2025, these changes in place were going to take effect, and then we didn't know what was going to happen after 2025, right? So now tax brackets and some of these lower corporate tax rates from TCJA, they're now permanent. So we know that that's going to be the case going forward. Helps us with planning a little bit more. So this could be good news for high income earners. Lower marginal rates are being locked in. It does, I will say, disproportionately favor wealthier households, while, yes, the percent change to tax brackets for lower income individuals is larger. We have to talk about kind of the weighted average or the weight of like these things how they happen to different tax brackets. And I do think there's an argument to be said that some of these benefits do disproportionately favor wealthier households. The standard deduction expansion was made permanent. So they increased the standard deduction back in 2017. It was nearly doubled, basically. So they nearly doubled the standard deduction in 2017. And that was going to encourage less people to itemize, essentially, making tax filing a little more simple. So this does mean fewer people, going forward still will itemize deductions, including SALT, which we'll talk about here in a second. And people get more of a easy deduction, I guess you could say, because the deduction is just higher overall versus like going and itemizing and it making sense to itemize because we have more to itemize than we would on the standard deduction, So it's kind of an interesting situation there where good in a lot of ways, I guess you could say. Now, SALT, I mentioned, so that's the state and local tax cap. It was raised temporarily. And it's also, okay, let me back up. So the state local tax at SALT, SALT, there was a cap for the past, since 2017, basically. It was $10,000. So you could only deduct $10,000 of your state and local tax paid if you were itemizing. So only if you were itemizing. So let me just talk through this a little bit more because I think sometimes the SALT cap like people talk about it a lot, but sometimes people don't quite know exactly what it is. So, the SALT tax deduction lets taxpayers deduct the state and local taxes they pay, like income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, from their federal taxable income. It's designed to avoid kind of that double taxation, paying tax on money that already went to the state and local government. And starting in 2018, under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or TCJA, I'm going to reference that a lot today. This deduction was capped at 10,000 per year. And so that meant no matter how much you paid in state income or property tax, only $10,000 was deductible. So if you lived in a high tax state, so like New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois, maybe Massachusetts, and earned pretty high income, you were almost certainly paying well above the 10,000 a year in combined property and income taxes. And so this cap limited how much of that burden you could really deduct from your federal tax returns. So, let's say a physician in California pays 30,000 in state income tax and $12,000 in property tax. That's $42,000 in SALT, in state and local taxes. Under the cap, previously, they could only deduct 10,000 of that. So that meant 32,000 of the tax payments that they did make don't actually do anything to reduce their federal tax bill. Only the 10,000 did. So a lot of high income earners, were taking advantage of maybe this SALT deduction if they were itemizing. Now the change here, so the big beautiful bill, the change here is that the SALT cap has risen to 40,000. $40,000. So that's a big difference. And that's, I could argue that's a big win for folks that do pay a lot in state and local taxes. But it's temporary. This is not something that they said is permanent. It's temporary. So basically, it's temporary for 5 years. So $40,000 for 5 years. After that, it drops back down to the 10,000 unless Congress acts again or makes it more permanent, kind of like some of these, prior tax changes were now made permanent. So we could see it be made permanent in the future. So kind of in summary here, if you're in a high tax state, this temporary SALT cap is probably going to save you a lot of money in the future when it comes to taxes. But it's not permanent, and so it's hard to make like permanent long-term plans off of this, right? It just may be a temporary benefit. So there could be, strategy here, opportunities to bunch deductions or somehow time some major property tax payments strategically in the years that the higher cap is active. So there's some strategy here that I'm sure a tax professional is going to want to take advantage of or kind of take a look at when they're looking at your tax situation. But that's the deal with SALT. Tax credit, there's been a child tax credit bump, but not as big as what was proposed. So I think the House initially proposed 2,500 for the child tax credit. That's something we could take if you have a child. It did increase though from 2,000 to 2,200, and that is permanent. That's not something temporary. So it didn't get up to the 2,500 like the House version wanted, but it went up from 2,000 to 2,200. So, a small benefit there, modest benefit for families that have dependents. It does still get phased out though for higher earners. So that's something that not everybody could take advantage of if you're a very high earner. Currently, how it works for the child tax credit is it has to be a child that's under 17 at the end of the tax year. It has to be your child, so your son, daughter, stepchild, eligible child from foster care, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, half brother, half sister, or descendant of one of these. So there's kind of a long list on the IRS website. You can't, they can't provide more than half of their own financial support to take this credit. They must have lived with you for more than half the year. They must be claimed as a dependent on your tax return. Let's see. They can't file as a joint return. So if they're, 17 or 16 and married, Unlikely, but if they were, you can't take the deduction. They have to be a U.S. citizen or U.S. national or U.S. resident alien, must have a social security number. And let's see, income factors. So the income here, where it starts to phase out for the 2024 child tax credit, is 200,000 or 400,000 if filing a joint return. But let me look if they've got guidance on 2025. And for 2025 going forward, what it looks like is you cannot take the credit if a family earns less than 2,500 a year. So it doesn't like bring taxable income down to zero. But they're eligible for a portion of the tax credit up to 1,700 in 2025. Even if your tax liability is zero, you could still receive a check up to 1,700, it looks like. But where you're probably wondering like what the income threshold is. So for a single filer, the credit starts to decrease for any amount they earn past 200,000. Joint filers, the threshold is 400,000. So it doesn't seem like the income thresholds have changed as far as we know right now. If you're earning more than 240,000 as a single filer, it's phased out. We can't take the credit. And if you earn more than 440,000 for a joint filer, we don't receive anything. So that's the income thresholds we're looking at there. Since we're talking about children, let me also mention that Trump accounts, if you haven't heard these yet, basically they're baby bonds that Trump has come out with, supposed to come out later this year in 2025. But babies born here in the US will get a $1,000 seed deposit in a government-backed account. So families can contribute up to $5,000 per year towards this. Employers can also contribute up to $2,500 tax-free. I'm sure it has to be part of some defined like benefit program with the employer. And at age 18, the account converts over into a Roth IRA. So there's some positives, pros and cons to this, right? Just like with everything. It gets an early start on savings. It encourages that immediate savings, basically. Starts compound growth from day one, which is good, and can lead to significant savings by adulthood if taken seriously, if continued to contribute to, or if you continue to contribute to it. Even with modest contributions, a child could have 50 to 100,000 by the age 30, like doing some compound interest math. So that's pretty cool to think about. If we're starting with 1,000 and we're contributing something to it, right? Not just the 1,000 sitting there and growing. It will grow, but not to 50 or 100,000 by itself. It does have broader access than 529s in the sense of there's no like income limits. You can contribute to it at any income level. The funds aren't restricted strictly to education, which 529s are. They have to be for qualifying education expenses. So that's maybe a positive there. It does also encourage employer engagement, which is pretty cool. So employers can offer contributions to their employees' children as a benefit, similar to like the 401k matches or like the education contributions that some employers have been implementing too. But could be a really unique like recruiting tool for family-focused workplaces. But there's some cons, of course. Some of the rules about contributions, the tax treatment, the rollover timing, and eligibility that can vary from year to year and from tax bracket to tax bracket. There's some complex stuff that I think needs to be ironed out. More guidance, I think, is going to be coming on these Trump accounts for kids. So stay tuned. IRS and financial institutions all over are going to have to develop some new like infrastructure to manage and monitor these types of accounts because they're new types of accounts with new terms and conditions. So that's going to create some work, I guess you could say, to get these up and running and to monitor them and execute them. Some would argue that 1,000 is helpful, but it's not transformative for low income families. Some critics are arguing that this may be more of a political gesture versus a serious wealth building solution, right? And there could also be the argument that better alternatives exist. So a lot of folks could argue, like, what about just true baby bonds? Where government provides a larger needs-based contribution 5,000 to 10,000 at birth, that can be accessed for major life expenses like education, housing, or retirement. What about that compared to this for everybody, right? Or just universal savings accounts that allow unrestricted contributions and growth, like a brokerage account. We've talked about that, especially on our brokerage account episode, where, that a non-retirement investment account could be used for anything. And if we're being smart about what we're investing in that account, we're being tax efficient, maybe with some tax loss harvesting, it could be a really great, flexible, easy account to be saving for anything in, which could be childcare or, future college expenses, future retirement for your kid, even. It could be, earmarked for just long term savings for your kid. So there's other more universal, more flexible, less complex solutions out there as well. Some of the initial thoughts about like the child tax credit, Trump accounts for kiddos. What about tips and overcome? Sorry. What about tips and overtime? That was something that was pretty interesting. So there's no tax on tips. There's a provision that allows workers to deduct tip and overtime income up to 25,000. There is a phase out though, so you can't be making more than 150,000 as single or 300,000 as joint. If you're making above that, you're not going to be able to take this kind of deduction or not have to pay tax on tips or overtime. But it does primarily help service industry workers. Probably less relevant to a lot of our SLP Wealth clients, but still part of the theme of targeting like everyday earners here. So that was kind of an interesting take. That was kind of an interesting provision that was included. It does seem like there's going to be some Medicaid changes, restrictions, or healthcare cuts. So the work requirements when it comes to Medicaid and eligibility when it comes to Medicaid, seems like there's going to be some more strict rules around this. There's going to be bans against Medicaid funding gender affirming care, and there's going to be some enhanced or basically it's going to eliminate coverage or enhance coverage for undocumented immigrants as well. So folks who rely on Medicaid or who work in hospital systems with a high Medicaid patient load could be affected. So, you know, a lot of our borrowers may not be the demographic that is on Medicaid or using Medicaid for themselves, but they may have parents that use Medicaid, or maybe your patients, your client base, your patient base uses Medicaid. And so that could affect the workload or the demographic of patients that you're seeing. So that's going to be something that I think we're going to see more and more coverage on, like the actual impacts of what some of these restrictions and some of these newer requirements or stricter eligibility looks like and how it impacts people. But it does seem not great. It seems like there's going to be folks that are going to be losing coverage. And, that could be really scary for folks who are in that situation. There's also some changes to SNAP. So this is like the food stamp program where states are now particularly responsible for the costs if error rates with the SNAP program exceed 6%. So basically, government is putting more pressure on the state to manage these programs, to uphold their, to reduce their error rate when it comes to the error rate isn't necessarily a measure of program fraud, but it indicates an unacceptable amount of waste that occurs at the state level. So SNAP stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Their payment error rate is calculated by assessing the accuracy of the state agency's eligibility and benefit amount determinations for SNAP recipients. It's a two-tier review process. State agencies first review a sample of their cases and then the federal government reviews a subsample of those as well to validate the state's findings. But it sounds like this might be more on the state now. And the error rate is determined by quantifying the number of cases with payment errors, including both overpayments and underpayments. So not just overpayments, but they're counting the underpayments as part of this error rate as well. And they have to exceed basically to be counted, they have to exceed a specified tolerance threshold. So they have some kind of tolerance level or range. The national error rate is then calculated as a weighted average of the individual state error rates, and then with the weighting based on each state's proportion to the total SNAP benefit issuances. So that's how they break it down, I guess you could say. And they want this to be less than 6%. And so the state, and if not, if the state is showing an error rate higher than 6%, they're going to be more responsible for the costs associated with the SNAP program. They also extended the work requirement age to age 64. So that's going to be also a change in the age requirement. And so this cost shifting to states could lead to a lot more administrative burdens, especially in like high cost of living states, which is not good. And this could have some kind of ripple effect when it comes to people who work in public health as well and food security or social work. It could have some impacts there when it comes to cutting costs or just excess work on the state and state agencies to be running these programs. There's some green energy programs that have been taken out. So basically, this bill is going to be ending the EV tax credits and the home energy efficiency incentives that have been around over the past couple of years. I know some clients have been interested in this. They've been looking into this. We knew they were temporary though for the Tax and Jobs Act that started in 2017, 2018. This bill basically kills the greenhouse gas reduction fund. There's not really any incentives now for buying electric vehicles or installing solar or efficient heating systems. And environmental investors and climate focused portfolios might see some disruption. So this is where like ESG funds could start to see some effects from this bill, some political effects that are trickling into like green energy. And ESG funds typically have some kind of green energy underlying withholdings. So that might be something to look at if you're invested in ESG funds. And ESG funds, that just means like environmental, social, and governance funds. They could be part of an investment portfolio that include companies demonstrating their commitment to sustainable and responsible practices across those three key areas. And that's why this could have an impact on those companies in particular, because if there's no longer credits or benefits here when it comes to the tax code and when it comes to people participating in green energy, then that could, of course, affect businesses and their profitability when it comes to what they're doing with their environmental, social, or government work when it comes to these things. There's going to be a lot of money going to the border wall and immigration enforcement. This, I think, not to be dramatic, but I think it is one of the largest border enforcement budgets that we've seen in U.S. history. About 40, I think it was 46.5 billion for the continued wall construction, and then 45 billion for immigration detention, plus another 30 billion for ICE hiring and training. So lots of money going towards the border wall and immigration enforcement. Policy may shift public funding. This overall, I think, does shift public funding priorities, kind of diverting resources away from our own domestic social programs. So something to be cognizant of this, all of these things added up. It's not saving anybody money in the sense of it's not saving our nation money. This is going to increase our debt ceiling. They're estimating between 4 and 5 trillion. So that's kind of interesting, right? They think the deficit is going to grow over the next 10 years because of some of these changes. But the CBO expects this to increase spending, increase market participation, increase potentially jobs. And so there's a lot of pros and cons, right? It's hard to I'm trying to walk the line and be like very not political about these things. But a lot of these things, of course, are touching political flavors of what's being implemented, why they're being implemented, and what the effects are going to be, essentially. Interestingly, there's provisions when it comes to AI in the Big Beautiful Bill. And I thought it was also kind of interesting. So I still have an S corporation for some of my 1099 contract work that I do with Student Loan Planner. It came from the U.S. Department of Commerce, and it was a business trends and outlook survey. And I got reminded like 3 times to complete this I think it was within like 2 weeks or something. I got multiple emails about it. And it came from econ.btos@census.gov. Basically, it was a survey that was asking about how my business was doing and the time frame was pretty specific. It was between June 30th and July 13th. Has production increased? Has it decreased? Has your price for services increased or decreased? And they asked multiple times about my participation in AI, which I thought was kind of interesting because in the Big Beautiful Bill, they're talking about pressing a pause on AI regulation, which is kind of interesting. But they're asking about it in other business trend surveys. How many businesses are using AI to some kind of extent to help with efficiency or to help with their business operations. So, kind of going back, talking about like the permanent changes and the temporary changes, some of these temporary tax policies, like the SALT tax deduction we talked about earlier, why do these exist? Why do they do things temporarily versus just like making something law? Well, oftentimes Congress will use temporary provisions to keep the 10-year cost of the legislation lower due to like budget reconciliation rules. So they're always projecting costs out 10 years in advance. And if it's a temporary provision, we're only seeing the costs of that like factored into the budget for however many years that we're plugging it in, right? So in this case, the SALT tax deduction is that $40,000 deduction change is going to be applicable for 5 years. And lawmakers, they probably know they're going to review these different tax breaks, but they don't have to include that cost in the projections up front. So that might be a way to look at it when it comes to temporary things. But it's a problem. Temporary things implemented can be a problem because households, businesses, we don't know exactly how the rules are going to apply, in 2 to 3 or 5 years. We don't know if we could count on something sticking around. So example, think about this when it comes to energy credits, right? If an energy credit expires in 2027, is a homeowner going to be interested or incentivized to still install solar panels in 2026? Probably not, because they're not sure if that credit is going to exist after 2027. And so they may be thinking about having to take on that expense with no credit, no kind of taxable benefit, and having that all like be out of their own pocket. So tax planners, advisors, this just means that there's still some constant change and some more complexity for clients when it comes to planning, because we don't want to be making super permanent decisions, super expensive decisions off of temporary provisions. You know what I mean? So the tax foundation, I thought it was interesting. The tax foundation argues that more permanence and fewer gimmicky type changes, and returning to a more like simpler natural tax code could be beneficial. Their view is that growth and fairness are best supported by long-term clarity and not by policy whiplash. And I think that was well said. I think that's a great way to put it, because it does feel like some of these things are, I don't want to use the word gimmicky, but some of these things are they're so insignificant when it comes to like the bigger picture. So like, for example, the Trump accounts, the $1,000 for starting like a baby Trump account. Was that the best use of funds, right, for folks, or could that have been thrown into the child tax credit? Could that have been thrown into somewhere else in this bill or not even included and maybe reduced the 4 to 5 trillion of deficit that this all is going to come into play? I don't know. Maybe that's not the right answer or the right thing to pick on, but it's hard. Like it's hard to make decisions that are best for everybody, right? And so our government has to be thinking about everybody, not just the rich, not just the poor, but everybody. And it's hard to make decisions for everybody because there's a lot of different needs, a lot of different financial situations, personal situations, life styles, life situations. So I don't know, just kind of an interesting breakdown there. I haven't even chatted about the student loan pieces to the big beautiful bill, or the education pieces, I should say, because that's a whole other can of worms. I know Travis has been chatting about things on the Student Loan Planner podcast when it comes to student loans, and the impact of borrowing. But the education system is going to see an overhaul. That was another big part of this big beautiful bill that is something we were following very closely because that directly affects our clientele, our folks that we work with, because many highly educated folks, high income professionals tend to have lots of student loan debt. And so kind of the summary there on the repayment side of things, we kind of knew the SAVE plan was going away. Travis and I did a webinar on this recently for our SLP Wealth clients and SLP insiders. And what we talked about was, SAVE is basically dead, but maybe a morbid way to look at it or to think about SAVE, because it's actually going to be like around until 2028 technically. Could be sooner, depends on what some of these what some of these things what unfolds over the next like 6 months to a year, because things could be sped up a little bit. But basically how the big beautiful bill was written out is SAVE is dead, but they're not going to phase it out officially until like 2028. So it's here. People technically are on it, and they could technically stay on it in the forbearance until they're forced to be moved to a different plan, but it's not doing anybody any good. So interest starts to accrue on SAVE starting August 1st. We don't think that means payments because they have not explicitly said that, but interest starts accruing on SAVE August 1st. And that's different because for the longest time, we've seen SAVE at 0% interest while we've been in this forbearance limbo period, waiting for them to make a decision. They've made a decision. SAVE is dead. Interest kicks back in on SAVE, though, on August 1. So people could stay in the forbearance and have interest accrue until they're forced to be moved over to a different income-driven plan, which could take anywhere between now, 2025, and 2026. We just don't know. So our thought process, or how we were explaining it, it's like, putting it in medical terms, it's like it's here. It's maybe a brain dead patient situation where SAVE, like the body of it is here. You still see it in your portal on studentaid.gov if you're looking at your studentaid.gov situation, and we were on the SAVE plan. But it's not going to move forward. It's not going to progress. It's not going to give us loan forgiveness credit. So being in this forbearance, we're not working towards loan forgiveness at all. And interest is accruing, right? So there's the only benefit of sitting in the SAVE plan is that we're still in forbearance. We don't have to make payments yet. That's the only benefit. So that might be just something to know, is if you're someone who's trying to go towards the longer term forgiveness timeline, hanging out on SAVE to see what happens is not helping, because whatever your forgiveness credit was up until this point, that's what it's going to be until you get into another eligible plan working towards your loan forgiveness timeline. So our recommendation on that webinar was, there's probably few and far between reasons to stay on SAVE. Like if we really can't afford a payment right now, or we're really prioritizing high interest debt, or we're, waiting to be able to refinance the loans to pay them off, like maybe you hang out on SAVE for a little bit longer. But if you're someone who's trying to make progress towards PSLF or towards a longer term forgiveness timeline, we would say go ahead and make the change to income-based repayment. You could technically apply for pay if you're eligible. Pay is a plan that they're also going to phase out, though, between 2025 and 2028. So pay they're taking away because it was brought about by an executive order, not congressional action. It wasn't like legislative. So they're taking that plan away. They're taking ICR away and save. And what we're going to be left with is IBR. And IBR has two components, the new IBR and old IBR. New IBR, you are eligible for if you did not borrow before July 1st, 2014. So if you were a new borrower as of July 1st, 2014, when you borrowed your first loans, let's say you borrowed in 2015 or 2020, then you're eligible for new IBR. And that plan is based on 10% of discretionary income. It has a 20-year timeline to forgiveness. If you borrowed before 2014, but let's say not before 2007. So between October 1st, 2007 and July 1st, 2014, you could be eligible for pay, PAYE. Again, pay is going to be phased out at some point between now and 2028, but technically you could still apply for it. It still counts towards loan forgiveness for now until it's phased out. And it is a slightly lower payment than old IBR. So pay is 10% of discretionary income as well, 20 years to loan forgiveness. Where old IBR, if we have loans that are older than October 1st, 2007, or we get phased out of pay in the future and we have to move over to IBR because we're not eligible for new IBR. Old IBR is 15% of discretionary income and 25 years to forgiveness. So it's a more expensive plan. It's a longer timeline to forgiveness, but it still is loan forgiveness. So if your balance is a lot greater than your income and income-driven payments are kind of the safe haven, that could still be a good path for you to continue working towards loan forgiveness. And then PSLF, if we're working in a PSLF eligible job, we'd want to be on IBR as well. We'd be on either new or old IBR depending on our eligibility. But PSLF mechanically has not changed at this point, thankfully. So we just have to be working full-time at an eligible employer and making income-driven payments towards that timeline. So that's kind of the big repayment changes, I guess you could say. If somebody has Parent Plus loans, that's a whole other topic. But in summary, Parent Plus loans have to be consolidated by July 2026 to maintain access to income-based repayment. After July 1st, 2026, Parent Plus loans, if they're not consolidated, well, just in general, if we have Parent Plus loans after 2026, they are not eligible for any income-driven repayment plan. So that was a huge change. And this is going to have a big impact, I think, in the education system because Parent Plus loans, much like graduate loans, did not have a payment or did not have a cap on how much you can borrow. So if your graduate school or let's say for Parent Plus, your undergrad degree, like if they said it costs $50,000 per semester, you could borrow up to that $50,000 in federal student loans up until now. That's going to change as well. How much we can borrow is changing as well. And so Parent Plus loans not having access to income-driven repayment after July 2026, that's going to impact people who they still have kids in school or they're going to have kids in school in the future. I'll talk about the borrowing limits here in a second. But anybody who has Parent Plus loans, you want to make sure you've consolidated by July 2026. That's going to initially get you on the plan ICR, income contingent repayment, unless you've done a double consolidation. Then you could have access to IBR. But we have to be consolidated by July 2026 to keep access to income-driven repayment. After that, we would only have access to the standard repayment options, which is paying the loans off within a fixed repayment period, depends on our balance. But if our balance is greater than $60,000, that maximum term could be up to 30 years. So 25 or 30 years, depending on the standard or fixed plan that we choose. So not based on income though. And that means that if we're not on an income-driven plan, we don't have access to PSLF either. So Parent Plus folks really have to pay attention this year to make sure that they're making decisions with their existing loans and they know how to proceed with their future loans. because there's a phase out period with these borrowing limits. And these borrowing limits apply not just to Parent Plus loans, but also to graduate students, or just school in general, going to higher education in general. So the borrowing limits, how they're laid out, parents, let's say we're borrowing Parent Plus loans. After 2026, the maximum we can borrow per year is 20,000, and the maximum per child is 65,000. So that's it. So up to 65,000, that's how much we can borrow per child. It still could get expensive. If you have four kids and you're borrowing up to 65,000 for four kiddos for undergrad, that's still pretty pricey. But you have to know that after 2026, we don't have access to income driven plans. So that, 240,000 that we're borrowing, 250,000 that we're borrowing for four kids in that example, you're going to have to pay that back. The standard plan, you're going to pay the principal and interest and pay that all back over that time frame. So that's why this is so serious, especially for Parent Plus borrowers. And I mentioned Parent Plus because Parent Plus is the fastest growing loan type, because undergrad education has gotten crazy expensive too. And students could only borrow up to like 5,500 for their freshman year or 6,500 for their sophomore. They weren't able to borrow a lot under their own name. And so people were reverting or kind of leaning on these Parent Plus loans to borrow the rest. And so this is having an impact on people who are closer to retirement, right? Because if you're a parent, you're closer to retirement, and this could have a big impact on your retirement plans. So grad school, they're also going to be limiting how much we can borrow as well. I think for a non-medical degree, I think the limit was going to be up to, like, the aggregate limit was going to be up to 200,000. I think for a medical degree, it was going to be up to like 240,000, something like that. Don't quite quote me on that yet. We'll continue to unfold this, but that's very different because Graduate Plus loans used to allow us to borrow up to the cost of attendance. NYC, their School of Dentistry, we did the math on it a couple years ago. Travis wrote an article about like how expensive it would be to go and get a dental degree at NYC, and it was going to come out to about $720,000 after interest accrual and everything as well. But still, that's a big difference. 240,000 to what some schools were already charging, 700, 600, 500, whatever it was. That's a big difference between how much we can borrow in federal loans, right? So I think the result of this is a couple things. I think schools are going to have to potentially consider reducing the cost of attendance. And that could be a good thing. That could be a really good thing. But it could also be a bad thing, right? They reduce the cost of attendance. What does that mean for their existing programs? Does that mean there's going to be some layoffs? Does that going to mean some downsizing in the school? Does that mean less, let's see, does that mean that they're going to consider looking into partnering with private lenders for subsidizing the rest? So let's say, maybe you can only borrow up to 240,000 in federal loans, but that doesn't mean you can't go and borrow private loans to supplement. And I think that's a bad thing. I think combining the federal and the private loans could be really tricky because then we have two student loan payments after graduation. Private loans don't have forgiveness opportunities. They're not eligible for PSLF. It's just a loan that we're paying back. And then we're doing that on top of 240,000 of federal loans. So that could be pretty problematic if they don't reduce the cost of attendance or they don't reduce it enough and they push folks towards getting private funding to borrow the rest. I think this is going to make the conversation about return on investment for school a lot more serious. And it probably should have been serious, for a while, and probably has always needed to be more serious. What is the purpose of going to school and what is the potential income that I can see post graduation? What does my career prospects, what do they look like after graduation? That should be part of the equation because it is an investment in your future. But it's going to be even more of the conversation, I think, with parents and their kids. And I know I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole here with education and like the caps on how much we're going to be able to borrow, which probably isn't really applicable to you anymore because you're probably out of school, you're paying back your loans, you're just in the repayment side of this mess. But this does have an impact on your kids and what they're going to have access to in the future when it comes to education. And that could have an impact on your finances as the parent. This could mean like saving for college becomes even more, it's always been important, but maybe even more important. If it's important to you to have them avoid taking on debt in the future, like maybe you had to. So that's where like 529 accounts come in, the the Trump fund, $1,000, like that kickstart, right? Looking at brokerage accounts to set up to have flexible access to money to potentially go towards future college expenses. I want to do another episode on like college funding again. I think that's an important topic, but really a little bit goes a long way, honestly. So a little bit goes a long way when it comes to, saving and preparing for your kids to go to college. And if you're starting early, if you're putting it into your budget now when your kids are super young, then we have something. We're kind of treating saving for that as a bill, and it's always kind of baked into our cash flow. So if you haven't started, if this is something that is important to you, let's say you've gotten retirement on track or you're working on getting retirement on track for yourself, because that is key, that's priority. But if saving for college is also important for you, for your kids, start soon, because even a small amount goes a really long way, especially when it's compounded over time. And if you have questions about that, like that's part of like a comprehensive financial plan as well, like prioritizing what we should be putting money towards, where we should be putting money towards things, or where we should have the funds, I should say, what we're investing in, how we could be tax efficient with those investments, really kind of pulling all of the pieces together. But yeah, I kind of went on a tangent there with the education side of things at the end, but I think that wraps up the big kind of things I wanted to chat about when it came to this big, beautiful bill, breaking it down, kind of talking about high level, some of the stuff that's going to be impactful to maybe you, maybe not everything, but some of those things could be. So, future episodes coming up, I've got a couple guests I'm going to be chatting with about different things. So it won't just be me next time, thankfully, right? Sometimes I like to talk to people, not just myself. But thanks for hanging out with me today, and we'll continue to unpack this BBB, the Big Beautiful Bill, as it gets interpreted, as things get implemented, because the legislation is one thing, but like the interpretation and the execution of it is another. So we'll continue to keep folks posted and talk about the tax stuff, talk about the education stuff, and the things that are going to boil down to actually impacting you. So, but hope you have a great weekend coming up, and I will catch you on the next one.
Are you ready to unlock financial freedom faster with SLP Wealth? Get high-quality, affordable, student-loan-aware financial planning and get the best deal for it anywhere that you're going to find working with your own dedicated SLP Wealth financial planner that is able to give you the best integrated advice across financial planning, investments, and tax, along with all the student loan hacks that you know you need and that you know impact all other areas of your financial planning. The deal you're going to find here is special just for podcast listeners. If you go to promo.slpwealth.com, you can sign up with a great discount off your first month. That's promo.slpwealth.com.